In Italy, there's one family that controls Ferrari, Jeep, Chrysler, Maserati, and The Economist. They also own a soccer team worth over $2 billion. And they control Italy's largest bank. The Agnellis have more power than most governments do. They control 30% of Italy's stock market, employing over 360,000 people worldwide. Yet most people have never even heard their name. They're not just Italy's Rockefellers. They're the family that literally decides whether Italy's economy grows or crashes. And here's the wild part. They didn't gain this power by loyalty. They gained it by playing every side: fascists, allies, communists, whoever was winning at the time. So buckle in. This is the wild story of how one family decides the fate of Italy. In Italy, power rarely changes hands. It moves through bloodlines, from palaces to boardrooms. A few families have always pulled the strings behind the scenes. The Benettons in infrastructure, the Pirellis in industry, the Berlusconis in media. But none of them come close to the Agnellis. They are Italy's industrial royalty. They've built, or taken over, the country's most iconic companies, shaped its culture, and turned business into raw political power. And when you talk about the Agnellis, everything begins with one name: Fiat. This car factory became Italy's heartbeat, fueling its rise into an industrial powerhouse. Through Fiat, the Agnellis left their fingerprints on nearly every part of Italian life, from jobs to politics to national identity. At their peak, John Agnelli's companies alone were responsible for nearly 8% of Italy's entire GDP. His influence was so massive that government policies often moved in sync with Fiat's business interests. But before the Agnellis became the face of Italian capitalism, before they controlled banks, media, and global brands, they were just a small family in Turin, with one bold idea: to build cars for a country that barely had roads. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this are only just getting started. Alright, back to the video. The year was 1899 and Italy was still finding its feet as a new nation. The north was industrializing fast, but much of the country remained rural and poor. That's when Giovanni Agnelli entered the picture. A man with a military background and a rare talent for spotting opportunity where others saw chaos. While most Italians were stuck in the past, Agnelli was already thinking about engines, speed, and industry. Together with a small group of investors, he founded Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, or Fiat for short. By 1900, the first factory opened. Agnelli took command as managing director and oversaw 35 workers who built just 24 cars that year. Now that sounds small, but at the time it was revolutionary. Cars were still a foreign idea in Italy. There were no proper roads, no existing market, and no demand waiting to be filled. Agnelli didn't just build cars. He built the industry itself from scratch. An industry that would eventually become the foundation of his family's empire. By 1904, production had grown fivefold. And by 1906, Fiat was producing over 2,000 cars a year. Even more shocking, Agnelli had already opened a dealership in New York City. Before most Italians had ever seen a car in real life, that same year, Fiat became a corporation. What made this rise remarkable was that Giovanni Agnelli had started as a junior partner, yet managed to take full control of the company. He began buying up critical patents and introduced modern production methods, early assembly line systems, precision engine tooling, technologies that put Fiat years ahead of its competitors, but success rarely comes without cracks in the foundation. In 1908, Fiat faced its first real reckoning. The company was rocked by a major financial scandal. Rumors spread of falsified accounts and inflated share prices. The entire board was forced to resign. Giovanni Agnelli was dragged into court, accused of manipulating stock prices for personal profit. The prosecutors failed to prove it, and Agnelli walked free. But the damage was done. The scandal left a deep mark on Fiat's reputation, and on Agnelli himself. That brush with disaster changed him. He became more strategic, less trusting, and far more calculated about who he allowed close to power. So when World War I broke out a few years later, Agnelli didn't hesitate. He had already survived public humiliation, courtroom battles, and near collapse. This time he moved fast. He secured military contracts, scaled production, and transformed Fiat into the engine of Italy's war effort. By tying his company to national security, he ensured the security of his own business. Literally overnight, Fiat's factories shifted into wartime production. Plants in Turin ran day and night, supplying the Italian military with whatever it needed: trucks, tanks, airplanes, tractors, even diesel engines. By the time the war was in full swing, Fiat employed over 30,000 workers to fuel the battlefield. And the profits? They were staggering. But behind the numbers, the accusations grew louder. Critics accused Fiat of war profiteering. Agnelli knew he needed protection. So he turned to politics and found one of the most dangerous allies of his time, Benito Mussolini, a rising firebrand of Italian nationalism. In 1914, Agnelli began funding Mussolini's political movement. And when Fiat came under fire for its massive wartime profits, Mussolini returned the favor by quietly erasing the company's record. The alliance paid off far beyond expectations. By the late 1930s, Fiat employed over 50,000 workers and dominated Italy's industrial world. Then World War II erupted. Once again, Fiat's assembly lines shifted, from cars to tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines for Mussolini's army. When Italy sided with Nazi Germany, Fiat kept the supply chains moving for them as well. But soon, the tide of war began to turn against Italy. And Agnelli adjusted his tone just as quickly. He began voicing sympathy for the Allies, carefully watching which way history was moving. It wasn't ideology. It was survival. A calculated attempt to save Fiat and the family name from the reckoning that would come after the war. But despite all this, Italian authorities temporarily seized Agnelli's assets in 1945 for fascist collaboration. The punishment, however, was short-lived. Fiat was simply too vital to Italy's economy to dismantle, and the family's deep connections helped them escape real accountability. That survival opened the door to a new phase of the dynasty. After the war, the empire passed to a new generation. Giovanni's grandson, Gianni Agnelli, took charge in 1945. Gianni was sharp and ambitious. He understood that power had to be earned and then controlled. By 1963, he became managing director. Just 3 years later, he was chairman and CEO. In effect, he became the most powerful industrialist in Western Europe. And to be fair, he earned that reputation. Gianni helped pull Italy out of the ruins of war and into the modern age. He wasn't afraid to cross boundaries, literally. In the middle of the Cold War, he partnered with the Soviet Union in a deal that rewarded Fiat handsomely. Together, they built a factory capable of producing over 500,000 cars a year. It proved one thing: profit could outpace ideology. That mindset pushed Fiat onto the global stage. Soon, Fiat's logo was stamped on factories from Moscow to São Paulo. Under Agnelli, Fiat absorbed Italy's most iconic car brands: Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, and Maserati. No surprise, he turned Fiat into an empire that defined Italian engineering. By his final years, Fiat had won 7 European Car of the Year awards and employed over 200,000 people worldwide. That kind of scale gave the company enormous weight in Italy's economy. 1 in every 5 Italians working in manufacturing had some connection to Fiat or its suppliers. Entire towns, Turin, Mirafiori, Pomigliano, revolved around its production lines. A job at Fiat meant stability, status, and belonging. It meant being part of Italy's post-war recovery. But Agnelli wasn't finished expanding his reach. He set his sights on France. His target was Citroën, Europe's second-largest automaker and a crown jewel of French industry. Agnelli personally led the negotiations. He worked through his longtime allies, the Michelin family, the owners of Citroën and France's largest tire empire. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the deal went through, Fiat would dominate Europe's roads. The talks moved quickly. The Michelin family appeared ready to sign, then politics stepped in. French President Charles de Gaulle blocked the deal himself. He refused to allow Italian control over a national icon. Fiat was forced to settle for just a 15% stake. The Citroën setback taught Agnelli an uncomfortable truth. Economic power had limits. You could own factories, employ tens of thousands of workers, and still lose everything to a single political decision. From that moment on, the Agnellis realized something critical: controlling narratives. What people read, believe, and talk about mattered just as much as controlling machines or money. With public support on your side, even iron-willed politicians would hesitate to oppose you, fearful of losing elections. So the family's influence shifted, from factory floors to front pages. Gianni Agnelli opened the door to media power. Years later, his grandson would take it global, John Elkann. Gianni had once owned La Stampa, his hometown newspaper. John followed the same path, but on a much larger scale. The Agnellis made a pivotal move when Exor, their holding company, acquired a 43.7% stake in GD, Italy's largest media group. The deal was worth over €102 million. Those shares came directly from Chior, the holding company of the De Benedetti family. This wasn't just any seller. The De Benedettis were a dynasty that had long blended business with politics. Carlo De Benedetti was one of Italy's most influential industrialists, and a powerful voice in center-left politics. For decades, his newspapers shaped public debate, backed progressive causes, and influenced Rome's political landscape. GEDI had been tied to the De Benedetti family for generations. Now, control had quietly passed into Agnelli hands. This way, the Agnellis were effectively taking control of the country's narrative. Moving power from one circle straight into another, their media portfolio became massive. Together, the family now controlled La Repubblica, La Stampa, 13 regional newspapers, and even the airwaves through Radio DJ. This gave the Agnellis influence not just over national headlines, but over regional narratives across Italy. But the Agnellis didn't stop at Italian news media. In 2015, Exor, their holding company, acquired a 43.4% stake in the Economist group. With that move, they gained influence over one of the world's most respected international weeklies. And the Economist carries real power. Its reporting feeds directly into decision-making circles. It guides investors on markets, helps policymakers gauge global sentiment, and frames debates that ripple through boardrooms and ministries worldwide. Through this platform, the Agnellis found a way to project their voice far beyond Italy. Simply put, their media holdings allow them to influence how people think, which stories are emphasized, which voices are amplified, and which political narratives become normalized. Much like Murdoch's empire in the UK, or the Rothschilds' influence over the financial press, the Agnellis mastered power through perception. But influence through headlines was never enough. While shaping what people read, they were quietly planning something bigger: influence inside the corridors of European power itself. In 1983, Alberto Agnelli helped create the European Round Table of Industrialists, an elite and highly influential lobby that connected corporate giants directly to decision-makers in Brussels. It was the first clear sign that Fiat's ambitions had expanded beyond cars, towards shaping the rules of Europe's markets themselves. 3 decades later, that shift became official. In 2016, the family's holding company moved its legal and fiscal base to the Netherlands. Officially, Exor said the move was about a simpler corporate structure and a growing international profile. In reality, it meant fewer legal hurdles, more control over internal decision-making, and the freedom to operate as a truly global power, no longer constrained by Italy's strict corporate rules. It turned Exor from an Italian powerhouse into a European holding giant with the freedom to move capital wherever opportunity called. The consequences of that decision surfaced 8 years later in the form of global stakes. By 2024, Exor owned 10.1% of Clarivate, a New York-listed data and analytics company that guides decisions for universities, corporations, and governments. That stake could soon rise to 17%, giving Exor even more influence over one of the world's most important data firms. In an age where data shapes everything, from stock prices to public policy, the Agnellis position themselves exactly where information becomes power and profit. In other words, the family now has access to data that guides investment flows, research priorities, and market valuations before it becomes public knowledge. That gives them a decisive advantage. They can spot profitable sectors early, whether it's pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence, or patent markets. They can anticipate where funding, innovation, and regulation are heading, and position their portfolio to benefit first. And they've been extremely strategic about where they invest. By holding stakes across health, technology, energy, and industrials, they've gained leverage over some of Europe's most sensitive policy debates. They own pieces of companies that shape how Europe tracks information, funds clean energy, and builds new industries. This is the kind of influence that doesn't always make headlines, but quietly shapes the world underneath them. Because true power isn't built only on factories, money, or data. It's built on what shapes minds and emotions. And that's where the Agnellis made one of their most strategic moves of all, into culture itself. Because when you own what people love, you don't need to own anything else. And the Agnellis understood something crucial. Power built on emotion lasts far longer than power built on profit. Their move into cultural influence began early 1923, when Edoardo Agnelli became president of Juventus. Football united Italy like nothing else. North and South, rich and poor. And with every victory, the Agnellis earned loyalty, admiration, and mass devotion across social classes. Juventus placed the family at the very center of Italian identity. Each successor, from Gianni to Umberto to Andrea, carried that bond forward. Juventus trophies became symbols of family dominance. Victories on the field reinforced authority of it. But decades later, the family set its sights on another Italian obsession: Ferrari. In 1969, Fiat bought 50% of the company. That single move gave the Agnellis influence over both ends of society. Fiat represented mass mobility. Ferrari represented elite aspiration. Over time, Fiat tightened its grip. By 1988, it owned 90% of Ferrari, including shares once held by Enzo Ferrari himself. And when Ferrari eventually went public, the IPO made one thing clear: even on the global stage, real power still rested in Turin. The listing drew enormous attention, not for its numbers, but for what it symbolized. Ferrari had become more than a car brand. It was prestige, exclusivity, and craftsmanship distilled into a single name. And that halo extended directly to the Agnellis. Their reputation became tied to the same qualities: design, success, perfection, the full mythology of excellence. Through Exor and a deal with Piero Ferrari, the family secured 48.1% of the voting rights at Ferrari. They no longer needed full ownership. Authority was baked into the structure itself. Even in sports, their reach was cultural. Juventus' golden years, from the 1980s to the 2010s, ran parallel to Fiat's industrial peak. On the field, and in the factory, victories carried the same signature. They conquered Italy's passions. The next step was inevitable: to shape Europe's rules. By now, you've seen how John Elkann carried the family legacy into the modern era. To the public, he appears calm, almost distant from politics. But behind closed doors, very few major industrial moves in Europe happen without brushing past his reach. As the head of Exor, Elkann controls a €40 billion empire stretching from Milan to Amsterdam, and far beyond. But money isn't the full story. Today, power comes from being in the rooms where rules are written. And the Agnellis move effortlessly through Europe's elite circles: business roundtables, think tanks, foundations. These are the spaces where CEOs, politicians, and regulators shape policy long before it becomes law. This is where influence lives now. Elkann learned well from families like the Wallenbergs and the Pritzkers. Their example taught him how to turn family wealth into real influence, and how to use networks to keep the Agnellis embedded within Europe as power structure. He borrowed ideas, built relationships, and positioned the Agnellis at the heart of Europe's decision-making world. Through these circles, they continue to influence EU policy on green technology, mobility, and industrial competitiveness to this day. Ultimately, the Agnellis show just how far vision and patience can reach. From Turin to Brussels, their influence extends far beyond cars and sports. They shape narratives, industries, and power itself. The truth is, in a continent still ruled by old money and quiet alliances, the Agnellis remain one of the few families to transform a national legacy into continental power. They've shifted from building cars to shaping information, policy, and markets. They've outlasted monarchies, dictators, and political systems, without ever holding public office. So that raises a question: is Europe really built on democracy? Or on dynasties that never truly left? If you've made it this far, drop a car emoji in the comments so I know who stayed till the end. Make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.